So this is my design for basic stacking modular shelves, and in this video I'm gonna walk you through basically how I build them. So I'm using rough cut pine for this project, but go ahead and buy pre-milled 1x2 hobby boards if that's easier. I'm roughly cutting these boards down into shorter lengths just for convenience. It's not really a necessary step, but I find it more manageable in a tight space. The shelves I'm building here are going to be 2 feet wide, so I'm making sure these rough segments are at least longer than that. You can make these shelves as wide or narrow as you'd like, but I find 2 feet is pretty good. I'm ripping all these segments down into 1.5 inch wide strips on the table saw. Since these shelves are all part of a modular system, it's important that the dimensions of their components are all consistent so that they all fit together seamlessly. The goal is to basically replicate the dimensions of a typical 1x2 hobby board you'd get from the store. This keeps it consistent and allows them to work interchangeably since the entire project is made of 1x2 lumber. With everything cut to width, I'm using a flip-top jointer and planer to mill the boards to their final thickness, starting with the jointer to give you a nice smooth and flat surface to work with. I should add, this entire milling process without a dust collection system also tends to be really messy, so I'd suggest wearing a mask or using some sort of air filter just to avoid breathing too much of this stuff. This is partly why I suggest just to buy the pre-milled 1x2 boards. The dust can really be overwhelming in small workspaces. Now I'm switching to the thickness planer to finish milling. I'm placing the rough sides of the boards facing up so that the planer can smooth out the last remaining surface. Off camera, I actually had to run these boards through several more times before finally getting to my 3/4 inch thickness. And as you can see here, this is just the dust that was created by the thickness planer. In the future, I don't think I'll really be doing milling again because of this reason. The next day, I came back and sorted my newly milled boards roughly by size. This is just to optimize how I'll cut them to their exact lengths later. Before I do cut anything to length, I'm simply cutting one end off of each board to use as a reference. The reason I'm doing this is because I can't guarantee my original cuts with the circular saw were completely straight, so cutting one end off of each board with the table saw ensures I have a square reference to take measurements from. This is also why I gave myself a few extra inches to work with when rough cutting. I can now measure 2 feet from my reference end and using a stop block on the fence on the table saw to cut as many 2-foot cross members as I need. In this case I'm building 6 units, so I'll need 30 of these cross members in total. If you have enough material, cut a few spare boards just in case a couple have knots or defects. Now with the stop block clamped to the miter gauge, I'm cutting out smaller lengths that will make up the end supports to the cross members. The height and depth of the end supports is completely up to you. I decided to go with a 9x9 square, so I cut 24 9-inch boards for the depth and 24 6-inch boards for the height. If you're wondering why half the boards are a bit shorter to make a square, you'll see why later during assembly. Regardless of what dimensions you chose, you should be left with 3 distinct piles. 1 pile for your cross members and 2 piles for the end supports. So, to assemble it all, I like to use pocket screws since they're a strong and easy way to join boards. This pocket hole jig I have is fairly inexpensive and quite versatile, but it definitely has its drawbacks when it comes to drilling a lot of repetitive holes. There's different jigs out there that are more catered towards this type of use, and if you plan on making a lot of these, better jigs will save you from having to hold everything down by hand like I am here. To assemble the end supports, you can see how the 6-inch and 9-inch boards fit together to create a perfect square. I made sure to drill the pocket holes in the shorter vertical members so that the screws don't experience any load when the shelf is being used. They just hold it all together. I could then collect all my end supports and start pre-drilling my cross members. I'm starting with 5 boards for the cross members, and pre-drilling just helps prevent the end grain from splitting when driving in screws later. I'm using a scrap piece of wood as a jig to make sure I'm drilling consistently about 3/8 of an inch away from the end. I'm starting slow when driving the screws, again just to make sure I'm not going to split the end grain. The tops of these shelves use 3 evenly spaced cross members, 2 at each end and 1 in the middle. This part is easiest to eyeball, but try your best to make it as accurate as possible. Before I screw on the bottom boards, I'm actually repeating the step on the next shelf, which I'll use as a guide to tell me where the bottom boards need to go in order for them to all stack properly. You can see how I'm placing the bottom boards loosely where they would need to be before marking and fastening them into place. This is why using the top of another shelf is helpful when beginning, but once marked, I can just use a jig to position the rest. The fit should be snug, but loose enough to allow a bit of tolerance in your own measurements and allow periodic expansion or contraction of the material over time. With those 2 shelves finished, I can start production on the next 4 units, starting with the same process of drilling and assembly. I did eventually end up splitting the wood pretty badly on one of my end supports, so I glued it up best I could and set it aside to dry before moving on to the next shelf. I'm assembling this unit exactly as I did before, using the jig I made as a reference to make sure every shelf is spaced identically to the first. Coming back to that end support I glued up, I'm pre-drilling it again and very carefully driving in a screw while supporting the material with clamps to hold it together. I filled some of the leftover cracks with glue and then added a clamp once again just to hold everything together while I assemble the rest of the unit. You can see here I also did crack the end grain on one of the cross members, but at this point I decided to just leave it and move on. Here I'm putting together a simple base to support the very bottom shelf. The idea here is to give these shelves a solid foundation to sit on that's completely flat and level. Once in place, you can basically just start stacking in whatever configuration you'd like. In my case, I'm attaching a bracket to one shelf just to keep it from toppling over, but the units themselves are still completely reconfigurable. Once I have them stacked how I like, I can start filling them.